Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be taking a bit of a look at the d takes c5 sideline in the Winawer variation of the French defense. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and the Winawer is when white now plays knight to c3 and black plays bishop to b4. The mainline Winawer continues with the moves pawn to e5 and pawn to c5, and there are a number of possibilities for white here. The normal move is pawn to a3. That would continue with one of the more mainline positions. However, white can also play bishop to d2, who d takes c5, and queen to g4, which we saw in a previous video. So for this video, I'm going to look a little bit at d takes c5. The engine doesn't really like this move that much at first, but it's okay. It's an okay move. Engine really wants pawn to a3. And against both d takes c5 and bishop to d2, as well as, if I recall correctly, queen to g4, the move for black is just knight to e7. Just developing the knight to a good square, just waiting and seeing what white is doing. And the purest move for d takes c5 is for white to play knight to f3. However, I looked at the games that feature knight to f3, and I wasn't very impressed by them, like for either side. Like this move does not get played that much, but there have been some games. And here, the best choice for black is to play knight to d7 and get ready to take this pawn on c5 with the knight. One thing that, of course, is important about knight d7 is that you don't want to do it if white has the option of playing queen to g4, as that can be annoying because it would hit both the bishop and the pawn on g7. Like, it wouldn't be a losing position for black, just a little bit unpleasant. So that's why knight d7 is fine here, because the queen can't go to g4. And then the main move for white is bishop to d3. But white has tried a few other things. Bishop to b5 is not great. You just play a6, and then if white takes on d7, you can just take back with your bishop. Your bishop doesn't have a whole lot of good squares to go to, so, you know, putting it on d7, that's kind of its only good square, so white kind of is helping you develop. And if instead white plays queen to d4 to hit your bishop, in this case, it can make sense to take the pawn with the bishop, because normally you wouldn't want to because the bishop is doing some good work on b4. But in this case, you take back the pawn and you hit the queen is forced to move again. If the queen goes to g4, you can just castle, and then you have a reasonable position. Like, if white tries any bishop h6 stuff, you always have knight g6. That's important to remember. And if in this position white tries pawn to a3, you can just take the knight. If white takes back, you can take the pawn on c5 back right away. But you can also play queen to c7 and basically get ready to put some pressure on these pawns on the c-file. So by far in this position, the main move for white would be bishop to d3. And then we just take this pawn with the knight, improving the position of the knight, keeping this bishop over here where it's doing some good stuff. And then main move for white, in fact the only move that's been played in the Elite Chess Masters database, is the castle kingside. It was part of the point of bishop d3. And then black could take the bishop right away, or black could just play bishop to d7. And like both are fine. And then in this position, white has tried a few moves. Like with knight b5, this move isn't too scary because if you now take the bishop guards the d6 square, so you're kind of fine here. After queen takes, for example, you can actually just castle. And if white plays pawn to c3, you can actually just take the knight on b5 if you really want to, and b5, or you can just go here, and then after this, then take the knight. That's probably what I would do, since this bishop is usually a problem piece for you. And knight g5 has also been tried, but it's not really all that great. Again, we just take over here, and white will generally take back with the c pawn, And then there are a number of good choices for black here, like can just castle kingside or play knight g6. The reason why white will usually take back with the c-pawn here is because if you play h6, white probably has ideas of playing queen h5 with a pin on the pawn to the rook, and ideas of taking over here. But overall, this isn't too scary. Like, black can just castle here or play knight g6. Either is fine. In fact, there are probably even other moves for black to play. So, as a result, the best move, in theory, is knight to e2. But again, black can just take here. And white can take back either with the queen or the pawn. It's fine either way. If white takes back with the pawn, the position is kind of reminiscent of an advanced variation, except the pawn is not on d4. And if white takes back with the queen, then this position is also still fine for black. Like, black will probably play against this pawn over here, try to attack it, and, you know, maybe bring the rook to c8 at some point, just make use of the c-file. Oh, but overall, this position is pretty rare. Like, I think there are only 3 games in the whole Lichess Masters database that feature it, and I wasn't too impressed by them. So as a result, when it comes to d takes c5, I'm going to cover something that's much more commonly played. So after our move knight to e7, white can now play bishop to d2, which kind of can transpose to playing bishop d2 on move 5, and then d takes c5 after knight to e7, as we like playing knight to e7 in pretty much all cases. So here, since the queen can come to g4, we don't want to do knight to d7 because queen g4 would be a little annoying. Instead, we play knight bf6, attacking this pawn and also defending the bishop. After queen to g4, which is by far the most popular move for white, castles kingside, white castles queenside, and then there are a number of good choices for black in this position. Like, this is all fine for black. Like, I personally like the move pawn to f5, since the best thing for white to do here is to take this pawn. Like, normally you don't want to push the pawns in front of your king, especially when there's opposite side castling, but in this case, part of the idea is just to deal with this annoying pawn on e5 that's depriving us of these squares. If white tries defending the pawn on e5 with a move like queen to g3, we can actually just play pawn to f4, and white really doesn't want to take this pawn. This pawn's quite annoying. It's kind of cramping white, kind of doing the same thing as the e5 pawn does. If white does take the pawn, then you can actually take over here, and white can't play queen takes because then the bishop will drop. So white would have to take over here, and even though black would be down 2 pawns, this pawn structure is not good, and we've got opposite side castling, and black's going to be able to launch an attack very quickly. Like, black's probably going to go queen a5 at some point, maybe pawn b6 first and take back on b6, maybe rook b8, or maybe after b6 take back with the pawn, have the rook get in this way. You know, all sorts of nasty stuff. Lots of ideas, lots of attacking ideas for black. And if instead white tries defending the this pawn on e5 by keeping pressure on this bishop over here, like basically defending it tactically, because if knight takes pawn, queen takes bishop, then black can be like, okay, you know what, okay, I'm not going to win back the pawn, I'm just going to open things up and just play pawn to b6. And this is not fun, because if white takes, you can just take back with the queen, you're defending the bishop, you've kind of blasted everything open over here, b-file and c-file are open, and the threat on this pawn is kind of renewed. So the other move to consider would be queen to e2. This move looks very silly because it, you know, kind of blocks these guys a bit, especially the bishop. It does defend the pawn though. And here, according to the engine, the best move is rook to b8, but I personally still think pawn to b6 is perfectly fine. If pawn to a3, you just take, and if white takes back, you just take like this, and overall you just have a very nice center. This is just a very pleasant position for black. I quite like this. So with all that said, the best move for white, in fact, by far the most popular move for white, is to take en passant. So black kind of succeeds in getting rid of this annoying central pawn that was controlling some squares in black's territory. Black should take back with the rook. Taking back with the pawn is impossible because of the pin. And then the most popular move for whites here is bishop to d3. And then in this position, I personally like the move pawn to h6, which was played in the game. Like, I think this is a fine move, just, kind of defending this square from any bishop g5 ideas, and also, making it more difficult for white to put their queen on h7. So, like, queen h4 would no longer be threatening that anymore. So, before continuing, I thought that I should just introduce the players. So, with the white pieces, we have FIDE Master Espen Forsa, who is a FIDE Master from Norway. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much information about him. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Sahaj Grover. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is a Grandmaster from India. And let's see. He won the Under-10 World Youth Chess Championship in 2005, and he came third in the Under-20 World Junior Chess Championship in 2011, so the year that this game was played. In fact, he would have been 15 or 16 when this game was played. And more recently, he has won the South African Chess Open in 2017 and 2018. And this particular game, it was played at the Reykjavik Open in 2011, and more information about the players and the events can be found in the video description. And now back to the game. So I personally like this pawn to h6 idea. I think it's pretty decent. And in this position, white played the move knight to f3, which I think is where white started to go a little bit wrong here, even though the engine doesn't flag this move as an inaccuracy. Just from a practical standpoint, black actually has a very, very strong move here, which to an engine might look like nothing, but to a human looks very scary and is very hard to play against. So if you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out what black now played. It's a very cool move. It's very principled, also has some tactical ideas behind it. I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. So in this position, black played the move pawn to e5, which the engine considers to be inaccurate, but honestly, it is very hard to play white's side here. In fact, if you let the engine sit for a little bit, it actually kind of changes its mind after a while about this move. It's like, actually, this move's kind of okay. And in my opinion, this is just a really fun move to play. Like, not only does black get 2 pawns in the center, but black's attacking white's queen. Black has a discovered attack on white's queen, and black has some nasty ideas of playing pawn to e4, hitting this knight over here. Like, this knight on f3, even though knight f3 was a pretty intuitive move, it's actually a pretty significant weakness, because when there's a pawn on e4, or it's hitting the knight, right? Whereas, if black tried this back in this position, where black played pawn to h6, it doesn't quite work so well, because if e5, there's queen to h5 hitting this pawn over here, pretty annoying stuff. And if black tries blocking with pawn to e4, this is actually a terrible idea because of this cool idea with knight takes e4, kind of putting some pressure on the bishop. If black takes the bishop, then white can take back with the knight. So taking back with the pawn, there will be bishop to c4 check. And then there will be ideas of taking this bishop with a discovered attack on the queen on d8. And notice that since there isn't a knight on f3, this doesn't really work so well for black. This works great for white, but if there were a knight on f3, then white would have to deal with the issue of both the bishop on b4 and the knight on f3 kind of both being under attack. So that's why knight to f3 is kind of where white started to go a little bit wrong, in my opinion, even though it's a very intuitive move. So instead of going for e5 right here, black just played h6, just kind of waiting, just being a little bit defensive. White played knight f3, black played pawn to e5, And in this position, white played queen to g3. It's actually pretty tricky to see what white's best move is. Like, according to the engine, the best move for white is queen to h5. And then here, black should play bishop to f5. If black instead goes for the fork with pawn to e4, then white can play bishop takes e4, and after d takes e4, there's some stuff with bishop to g5. Remember this discovered attack. Queen to f8, bishop takes f6, and here it's actually better for black to take the knight. Like, taking the bishop with the queen is kind of a little bit scary just because the queen can infiltrate on e8. Like, maybe that's playable, but I wouldn't risk it. Better to just do this. And then if white takes like this, black should take like this. And then here, in this position, queen takes f3 is the best move for white. Right, like g takes f3 seems more intuitive since there's opposite side castling, but the problem with g takes f3 is that black can actually just trade everything and go into an endgame with a really nice pawn structure. Like, black basically tries to trade off the queens, like black's got some annoying stuff over there, as well as maybe over here, and basically these pawns, they're probably going for the world record of most isolated pawns in the position. Like, this is a terrible pawn structure. If black trades queens, black's most likely going to win that endgame, just because all of these pawns are incredibly weak. So that's why in this position, instead it's better for white to play queen takes f3, even though that's a little bit counterintuitive. It does win the pawn, and it does safeguard the knight. And overall, this position is, the engine actually seems to kind of still give a bit of an edge to black here, although it's a mess. It's a mess. It's quite a messy position. And it's unlikely that for anyone to actually see all this stuff without, having looked at this position beforehand. But anyway, that's not what happened in the game. Instead, after pawn to e5, white played queen to g3, and black was like, you know what? I'm not in any rush. I don't need to play pawn to e4 now. I'll just, just take this pawn over here. Bishop takes c5. Get my bishop away from, these discoveries over here. We have bishop to e3, and black's like, you know what? The queen's not particularly well placed on g3. I think I'm going to make use of that. Again, we see some nasty ideas of pushing a pawn with a discovered attack on the queen. Not only that, but not only are these minor pieces at risk of being forked, but also these guys over here. They're not doing too well either. So we have knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop to c4. White's going to win back the minor piece, but black's actually still doing quite well. Like, this move is still quite annoying because it would potentially win this knight. So, but black plays bishop to e6, and in this position, white played rook takes d5. The engine prefers bishop takes d5, but that's not much better. After bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, black would then have like the move knight b4. I think knight e7 would also work here, but knight b4 is pretty annoying. Just getting ready to push this pawn and win the knight on f3. All that kind of nastiness. Actually, the knight might be able to block on e5. I kind of overlooked that a little, but this is not a fun position anyway. Like, this trick might not work, but there might still be tricks of like rook c8 and all that kind of nasty nonsense. Maybe queen a5, hit the guy on a2. Yeah, what does the engine say white should do here? Rook b5, pawn to e4, or knight e5, queen to c8. This is not fun for white. This is very not fun. And let's see. If pawn to c3, there's some nastiness with knight to d3 check. So if white tries this, there's this idea, and then you'll be able to win some material here. Oh, and the engine's kind of savage. It doesn't even try taking the material right away. It's just like, no, I want more. I want to take more. Just, do this. Because f4 is not possible because you have en passant. So, anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Instead, in the game, white went for rook takes d5. And honestly, I don't really consider this to be all that worse than the alternative. Like, I think white probably calculated the alternative and was like, ugh. Anyway, so in this position, best move for black is knight to b4. Probably because of some of those nasty ideas of maybe queen c7 at some point, just putting some pressure over here. But black played knight to e7, which is also okay. Like, the thing to notice here in this case with the rook on d5 is that if the rook moves, the bishop on c4 will fall. Like, black will be able to take this. And the rook can't go here or here because both those squares are covered. So white went for rook takes d6, sacrificing an exchange. We have queen takes d6. And then white tried for queen g4. Or it's honestly pretty difficult to play white's side in this position. And like the engine prefers rook d1, after which like queen d4, bishop e2, some stuff over here, but black's still doing very well here in my opinion. Like, white is, has some targets for black to attack. But anyway, not what happened in the game. We have queen to g4. We have knight to d5. Black, of course, cannot take white's queen because of the pin. It would be very funny if black could, but no. Queen to e4. Knight takes e3. F takes e3. Bishop takes c4. Queen takes c4 check. And black's like, you know what, white? I think I actually just want to trade everything off. I'm up in exchange. You've only got a pawn for that exchange. Nope, up rook for knight. Let's just trade into an endgame. Because when you're winning, trading pieces, like when you're up material, trading pieces is generally beneficial, and when you're down material, trading pawns is usually the way to go. And white was probably thinking, you know what, I probably kind of have to do this queen trade here, because otherwise, my king's in much more danger than black's king, because black will probably, be coming in on the c-file, maybe get the queen, take over there, nasty stuff like that. White would have to play defense. So white's like, okay, fine, I guess I'll try to draw this endgame somehow. But that's very difficult, especially when your opponent is a grandmaster. Although, I forgot to mention this, black wasn't actually a grandmaster at the time this game was played. Black was an IM. Black was a very strong IM with a rating of, I think, 2495. Black became a grandmaster the year after, so I guess it's not that significant of a detail for me to forget. But anyway, rook d1, pawn to e4, hitting the knight. The knight does not have many good squares to go to. The knight has to go to d4, where it is kind of nice and centralized, but the problem is it's stopping the rook from getting into the game. Rook to f6. Rook is coming to this nice open file. We have pawn to c4. Rook to f2, getting onto the 7th rank. It's like, okay, I gotta defend my pawn somehow. Black's like, I want to keep a rook on the 7th rank. 7th rank is awesome. Best place for rooks to be. We have knight b5, rook takes d2, king takes, rook f2 check, king c3, rook takes g2, c5, king f7, and it was in this position that white now resigned. White decided to call it quits. And on the one hand, I don't really blame white since this position does look quite hopeless, but I probably would have myself played on a few more moves just to really see it, because sometimes you might miraculously find some crazy defensive resource, but I don't see anything here. Like, black's plan is most likely just to take this pawn and push this guy down the board. Like, white's pieces are very far away from stopping it. It's like white can try, taking this guy, but it's going to be a while before white can win this pawn, and black can bring their king over to the queen side to help defend against any pawns that are trying to promote. If white does somehow sacrifice their knight for the pawn over here, black's still got a rook that they can use to deliver checkmate. White probably should not let, black probably should not let white take this pawn just because it does make things more complicated. Although trading this pawn for this pawn is, is kind of okay. That's fine. Fine, like the king can stop 2 connected pass pawns. It's just when you got 3 rolling down the board, then things are kind of getting a little bit scary at that point. But anyway, white decided to resign here, and given that white's opponent was a very strong IM who was, very close to becoming a grandmaster at that point in time, I don't blame them. I hope that you enjoyed the game. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll try to have the next video out within the next couple of days. I was a bit distracted the past few days because I played a very, very good game in a club tournament on Monday. So, bye for now.